I woke up with a terrible cold this morning, so I'm on the ginger tea. If my voice gives way, I do apologise, but we soldier on, we power through. So as Jason said, my talk this evening is focused on St Peter's Loft, an art school founded by the artists Peter Lanyon, William Redgrave and Terry Frost in 1954. I'm going to use the first few slides today to talk about a little of the context in which the school was formed. I'll then speak about its purposes, its sort of general raison d'etre, and then I'll give a sense of some of the individual students, their contact with the school and its teachings. So whether you have heard of St Peter's Loft or not, it's worth saying that the sum total of our art historical knowledge is very scant indeed. And my research aims to address a significant gap in our knowledge of St Ives and Cornish modernism. So over the last 4 years, as Jason says, I have been engaged in my PhD research on the painter Karl Weschke, and I know that some of you were at my talk about him yesterday. And this led to a rather unexpected opportunity to embark on a relatively in-depth investigation of the school. And this is because, and we'll learn more about this later, Weschke was a student there who was quickly promoted to become one of its tutors. The St Peter's Loft has become a significant chunk of my doctorate, and although my thesis was submitted last month, I'm now in that sort of tense period awaiting for my examination, my viva. In order to protect some of the original research, and because this will also become a book, as I've recently found out, and nor do we have the time to go into every detail tonight, I'm just going to share some of my findings with you today, but you know, it is enough to sustain an hour or so talk. Okay, so what do we know? So from the offset tonight, I felt it was important to give you a sense of the information that's already available to us. How St Peter's Loft is art historically framed so far. So admittedly, you have to look quite hard, but there are various snippets of information available in a number of the books published about St Ives and its artists. But the most significant published insight of the Loft, in terms of those books that we have focused on St Ives and Cornish art, amounts to just one paragraph. And this is in Dennis Valbaker's 1959 publication, Britain's Art Colony by the Sea, which you can see here. So you can see why I felt it was important to research the Loft, and as I said earlier, thankfully Weschke gave me the excuse to do just that. And I thought I would start this talk by reading a bit of that paragraph to you now, and Valbaker says the following: "The St Peter's Loft School, founded by William Redgrave and Peter Lanyon, has developed to meet the requirements of students demanding a more modernistic training. In addition to the founders, Terry Frost, Karl Weschke, Anthony Benjamin and other abstract painters have taught at the school, which has a wide curriculum including, in addition to painting, courses in sculpture, printing, pottery and other applied arts. Originally established in the former fish loft off St Peter's Square, the school now operates in one of Porthmere studios. In addition to providing tuition, the school can, if desired, arrange for full board and accommodation for visiting pupils." And I want you to keep that line, "now operates in one of Porthmere studios," in mind, because it turns out this is not quite accurate, and it's a misconception that I've seen repeated, but I'm going to return to that later. Frost, as we will also learn, was not just a tutor, but indeed one of those founder partners. So why was St Peter's Loft School established? And to understand this, I wanted to give a sense of the wider context. And to do that, we've got to track back to Penwith Society of Arts in 1950. So I realise that a lot of you here will probably be familiar with the controversial ABC categorisations that were instigated by Barbara Hepworth and others at the Penwith Society of Art in May 1950. But if you're not, it's a ruling that saw members of the society have their practice placed into the groups of A, representational, B, abstract, and C, craft. We are told that Peter Lanyon was so infuriated by this decision that he simply resigned, but his reasons, as I will explain, are far more complex and deeper rooted. In reality, his resignation was not due to these categories in and of themselves. It may come as a surprise that he actually voted in favour of them, but rather that he felt that they were being forced through without wider discussion, and that the increasingly vocalised concerns of members are being blindly disregarded. In relation to this, Lanyon was also progressively frustrated by the way in which the constructivist-led abstraction was taking over St Ives, something he would later articulate as being alien to Cornwall and Cornishness. Regardless, you can certainly see how the ABC went against the Society's founding principles, which were expressly designed to see all art forms as equal. And on screen, thanks to the Penwith Gallery archive, we have a scan of Lanyon's resignation letter from the Penwith Gallery. And as you can see, it's certainly short and to the point. It simply states, "Please accept herewith my resignation from the Society." However, in the course of my research and thanks to the Peter Lanyon archive, I've been able to read his original handwritten draft. And instead, this is very much longer and it's 2 pages long. It's incredibly valuable to us if we're to better understand Lanyon's position, and I wanted to read some of the extracts from that draft letter now. The ruling brought into the Penwith Society of Arts, which categorises the arts for administrative purposes, in inverted commas, was introduced by constitutional methods as a rule of purely social and organisational significance. This has been the fundamental mistake which has led to the resignations of members, which now include myself. The ruling is not in the same category as any other because it affects the actual, underlined, work done by members. The suggestion that it is for administrative purposes does not hide the fact that it proposes a division in artistic language which involves a philosophical and artistic question still being debated in artistic circles. To look at the situation clearly, it is obvious that or representational art will be governed by the familiar attitude of the Royal Academy and Royal Societies, and that abstract art, again in inverted commas, by the attitude of Ben Nicholson and Barbara Hepworth. Such a procedure of forcing an issue into the Constitution and then using a situation as a foreclosure of any further discussion is opposed to my conception of a free society. So we can clearly see in that unpublished draft, he's annoyed. The Penwith Society no longer represents what he deems to be a free society. And he was not the only member to feel this way. A number of artists also submitted their resignations. And a note on that point, as I said earlier, Lanyon is often seen as the instigator of this, but in fact he followed a precedent that was set by the likes of Hyman Segal, David Cox and Sven Berlin. And then he was joined by, for example, Guido Morris, Isabel Heath and the like. This argument became further inflamed over subsequent years, with Lanyon using the St Ives Times and Echo as a newspaper as a sounding board in which to declare his exasperation at the Society, and therefore publicly confirming his position on art in West Cornwall. And in order to further understand these frustrations, I wanted to give a sense of that spat as it played out in the pages of the St Ives Times and Echo. And I'm not going to go into great detail about this this evening, but I felt it's an important addition to this talk, as it will further aid our understanding of why the St Peter's Loft came into being in the first place, and why Lanyon felt it was necessary. On the 21st of August 1953, a letter from the modernist polymath Herbert Reed was published in the newspaper. So keep in mind, this is a couple of years after that Penwith Society split, and the argument is still very much in evidence. Reed at this time was the Penwith Society's president, and he also accepted his knighthood in the same year for his services to literature, which is slightly weird for someone who is a proud anarcho-syndicalist, some might say. I'm going to read you a couple of sections from his letter, which he writes from his house, Stonegrave, in York. Mr. Peter Lanyon accuses the Penwith Society of Arts of perpetuating a division between modern and traditional art. He further insinuates that this forced division is to the benefit of a favoured few. I've presided over the Penwith Society from a distance, and I may have missed some of the finer points of art politics to which Mr. Lanyon refers. But from this distance, it has always seemed to me that Penwith Society has set an admirable example in developing a regionalism in art, which in my view is the only art politics that matter in the long run. I've seen no signs of intolerance in the exhibitions so far held by the Society, but one is not aware of a minority unless it is willing to stand for election. I'm writing this as an individual and without consulting the officers of the Society. My desire to see the Society as an art centre for the Penwith region, not narrowly dogmatic, but promoting an activity, in brackets the art of painting, and at the same time a sense of community. A sense of community does not mean the obliteration of differences. Indeed, it thrives on rivalries. But the first step, I think, is to agree to differ, which is what I had imagined to be the distinctive merit of our society. So I think that the key words in that letter to keep in mind are minority and regionalism. Lanyon would, I propose, position himself as a leader of minority, and that he absolutely saw the virtues in and need for a regional art for Cornwall that was rooted to the county. And I'm going to return to that later. So indeed, Lanyon was in somewhat of a unique position that he is one of the only so-called St Ives modernists to actually be from the town, so Brian Pearce being the other notable other. This virtue was often a means for Lanyon and others to propose that his art was more in keeping, genuine and valid to Cornwall. So, for example, in 1950, Ronald Bottrell, who was then Director of Education for the British Council, wrote the following in relation to Lanyon. To see Cornwall as a Cornishman sees it, it is necessary not merely to have been born and brought up in the county, but to have come from Cornish stock. Of course, the definitions of Cornishness is something that we still very much debate today. But the point here is that Lanyon was not just frustrated at the Penwith Society, but also the direction of art in Cornwall more widely. And this is obviously a concern that was shared by others. Before I move on to talk about the foundation of St Peter's Loft in more detail, and as a means of following on from that last point, I wanted to end this section by reading you some acerbic words from Lady Manda, who writes the following on Lanyon's painting. This is the work of a true Cornishman, born and bred in West Penwith, not one of the cuckoo orphans who've come down to claim the home where rightful heirs belong to be. Lanyon's work has a backbone of granite underneath. When this trips up the foreigner, there is a chuckle from the downs and the knockers deep beneath the soil. So, St Peter's Loft was founded in July 1954 in the old net loft directly above us?
It's
just over there. But yeah, above us. And on screen is an image of the slope, which you can still see leading up to what is now the Porthmeor Print Studio. Lanyon is said to have named St Peter's Loft after the street adjacent to the one that goes down the right-hand side of the chapel. But knowing Lanyon in the course of my research, I also see this as a wonderfully sort of tongue-in-cheek self-canonisation. It strikes me that Lanyon has this great sense of humour, and a lot of the letters I've seen are full of these barbed wits, and often art history will strip an artist of their personality. The loft was rented from a Mr. Thomas who owns the entire building, including what is now Penwith Gallery. These gallery spaces were pilchard cellars and somewhat dilapidated at the time that the loft was taken on. And I've been told that the St Peter's Loft students were apparently no stranger to strange scents wafting up that were sort of ingrained in the building to meet them. The school's promotional leaflet, and this is the second printing of that, which you see here, described a fine art training studio, workshop and pottery, offering practical training in the foundations of artistic practice from drawing, painting, engraving, etching, linotype, modelling and pottery, and that students were encouraged to work out of doors and visit places of interest. So Lanyon enlisted William Redgrave and Terry Frost as co-founders. Redgrave almost certainly due to his more traditional focus of portraiture, but also the fact that he was increasingly developing his skills in sculpture. It's often been said on several occasions that Redgrave was encouraged into sculpture by Francis Bacon in his brief and infamous period in St Ives, but he was certainly already working in clay and using the school's facilities to sculpt long before this. After all, the school had been active for 5 years before Bacon arrived, but I'm going to return to Bacon later. In his book on Terry Frost, Roger Bristow describes how Redgrave had an antipathy, if you can say the word, to abstract art, and that Frost and Lanyon therefore thought he was the perfect choice in balancing their modernist approaches. Terry Frost, I feel, was enlisted as his painting at this time in particular was finding its own distinct voice, and one that was importantly a style removed from those abstract constructivist dominances that I outlined earlier. As Chris Stevens writes, the Loft was part of a strategy to establish an alternative power base to Nicholson and Hepworth. And although a founding partner, Frost's contact with the school was quickly diminished. Soon after the foundation of the St Peter's Loft, he was made Gregory Fellow of Painting at the University of Leeds, and he held this post until 1956. So we can sort of understand in that Val Baker quote earlier why he was deemed in terms of a tutor and not a founding partner. Also, Herbert Reed was on the selection panel for the Gregory Fellow Board. However, Frost would return each summer and would teach during the extended university holidays. In 1955, Lanyon wrote a letter to Art, News and Review, and it's one of the best records I found for truly understanding why the Loft was founded, and I'm going to read a couple extracts from the letter now. The St Peter's Loft was founded by William Redgrave, Terry Frost and myself. Brian Winter and others are visiting painters and lecturers. I was born in St Ives 37 years ago and therefore initially close to the St Ives School and the Newlyn School, which flourished before Christopher Wood, Ben Nicholson and Barbara Hepworth started their Cornish adventure. The establishment of the forcing house of the Nicholson School of Abstract Art at the Penwith Society is, in my opinion, a tragedy for what was a St Ives school devoted to painting and not only one aspect of it. St Peter's Loft does not support a division between the tradition of St Ives and those present and doubtless future isms which may fasten on the parish. It aims to maintain a sense of painting as a traditional activity associated with thorough knowledge of the craft. So there we have it. So this is Lanyon really sort of laying out his frustrations, naming Hepworth, Nicholson, Wood, etc. And before I read that letter, I explained how Terry Frost had often returned to St Ives each summer, and that brings me to another point. I have seen in that scant existing art historical material that the Loft is often described as a summer school, but this is just not the case. It was in fact operational all year round, with many students using it for, as example, as a more spacious sort of overspill to their own studios, the means to work on sort of larger paintings and the like. Prices were 5 guineas a week, June to September. 3 guineas a week per week, October to May, and 3 guineas per week for a period of 2 months or more. The school, like so many businesses here in St Ives, certainly knew the currency of creative tourism and cashed in by advertising in a number of newspapers and magazines such as The Spectator. And here on screen is an advert from 1958 as seen in the Painter and Sculptor Journal of British Arts, which was edited by the artist Patrick Heyman. You will notice by this point that Frost is no longer named as a partner. It also states that accommodation can be arranged. This accommodation included first and foremostly the guest house, which was run by Redgrave and his wife Mary, who was known to all as Boots, and that was on Island Road, so just a 2-minute walk from here. I've not been able to find the exact date for this, but I also found a clipping from the Telegraph when one of their reporters visited the school, and they described the following. The St Peter's Loft is in the fishermen's quarters just behind the harbour. The two principals are Peter Lanyon, the modern landscape artist, and William Redgrave, the portrait painter. Other teachers and lecturers take classes including pottery and engraving. Peter Lanyon took me around one of the studios whilst the students paused for their morning tea. A guest house accommodating 9 students is attached to school for 1 guinea a day. Among the first students to respond to one of these adverts in its first years was Tony O'Malley and Jeremy LeGrice. So in spring 1955, Tony O'Malley saw a St Peter's Loft advert in a copy of the New Statesman, and he attended the first summer school here at the Loft in the same year. He then came back every summer until 1960, and he eventually took the plunge and relocated to Cornwall, and he remained here until 1990. As David Whittaker points out in his book on O'Malley, the Loft was the nearest he would get to anything resembling formal art classes. And although Whittaker stops short of saying this, I certainly believe the Loft to be the most significant foundation for the progression of O'Malley's painting. There also seems to be this sort of unspoken Celtic kinship between him and Lanyon. O'Malley was from Ireland, from Callan in Kilkenny. A little small plug, I've just written a chapter for a Routledge Handbook to Irish Art that looks at Irish artistic diaspora in St Ives, and that will be published next year. Much has been made of O'Malley's use of sombre and muted colours in the mid-1950s and early 1960s, but I now consider this somewhat of a defining characteristic of the work produced by or under the umbrella of the St Peter's Loft and its teachings. This, I believe, was particularly due to Karl Weschke, who, as I said in my introduction, turned student turned tutor at the Loft. Weschke had met the painter Dorothy Mead when he was at London's St Martin's School of Art in 1949, and she, as a member of the Borough Group, introduced him to various artists in the circle of David Bomberg. In terms of those muted colours then, you could conclude that these are somewhat Bombergian, but my research finds that instead, and far less romantically, it was a much more practical consideration. Quite simply, there were certain paints and pigments that were out of his price range. Students at the Loft were asked to pay for their own materials, so browns, muddy yellows, blacks, etc. were more financially accessible. Indeed, Weschke reflected upon this point, and he said, and I'll quote from him here, "I can show you 2 tubes of paint. One cost £2 and the other almost £60, and they're both the same size. I painted with earth colours as they were cheaper and safe." So Weschke's more affordable colours became quickly favoured by his students, particularly O'Malley and Le Grice. And also there's a really nice anecdote that I was told that because of Weschke, Le Grice started painting a really thick impasto. He used up all of his paints, he wasted all of his money, and Peter Lanyon had to phone his mum and ask for more money to be sent down. So now, before I move to look at Weschke in a little more detail, I wanted to share some words from O'Malley himself. A very short recollection of the Loft that he penned in 1990, and he says the following. "I was one of the first students with Jeremy Le Grice. The school and old Loft was all brown boards and oil. There was a lot of laughter. Peter loved the adventure of the whole thing and was as enthusiastic as we were. Dogma was brushed aside completely. Everything was possible through imagination and feeling, but it had to be bonded with intelligence." And that last comment on the necessity to bond work with intelligence is an interesting and important point. But after the course of my research, I'm definitely not sure that dogma was brushed aside entirely. Lanyon instilled in his students the importance of visiting exhibitions, of attending talks, of reading on art and aesthetics. The Loft, for example, had a carefully chosen library of publications for the students to browse, and ones that Lanyon and Redgrave felt were the most important. But this range of books, I found out, also included the works of Herbert Reed, but Lanyon used to use these as a way of showing ideas that he felt were out of date and to work against. So I know, for example, that Reed's Art Now was on the shelves, but Lanyon would refer to it to his students as Art Then. Followed, I imagine, by an informative lecture on Reed's irrelevance. The student Nancy Wynne Jones, who joined the school in 1957, recalls, "There are a number of art books in the Loft for us to browse. We could discuss any new art book, poetry too, in exemplifying the creative principle at work." So, Karl Weschke moved to Cornwall in 1955. A German, he had arrived in Britain as a prisoner of war, and on release from prisoner of war status, he lived and worked in London, including a short stint as a lion feeder's assistant at the Bertram Mills Circus at Olympia. In 1954, in a stroke of some fate, he was introduced by a mutual friend to the artist Brian Winter at the Café de Paris nightclub near Leicester Square, and that's still there today. It was Winter who had arranged for Weschke to move into a cottage at Higher Tregerthen, just outside Zena, which was once inhabited by D.H. Lawrence and his German wife Frieda. Winter was one of the earliest visiting tutors at the Loft. Basically, he got involved when he had the time. He was a very busy man, Brian Winter. And this gave Weschke an immediate foot in the door. And it might seem rather unexpected at first that Lanyon would champion Weschke, who really took him under his wing. As Chris Stevens states in his book, St Ives, the Art and Artist, Lanyon took Weschke under his wing, employed him at the St Peter's Loft, and enthusiastically promoted his work. Weschke recognised the kindness, but resented the sense of obligation that resulted. And to be honest, in my 4 years of research, I found little evidence of that resentment, but instead how Weschke would often speak favourably about Lanyon and the opportunities that were given to him. The two artists, I believe, worked well together because they had various things in common. For example, Lanyon had served in the Royal Air Force and Weschke in the Luftwaffe. Weschke's English was patchy at the time, but Lanyon could speak a little bit of German, and he actually gave up German to become an artist. German studies, to become an artist. Lanyon certainly saw in Weschke something that was mouldable to his anti-constructivist aims, particularly, I think, due to his perceived links to the Borough Group that I mentioned earlier. And again, Stevens reminds us that Lanyon would welcome newcomers to the town, especially if they were not abstract artists. When Weschke arrived in Cornwall, his paintings were indeed far removed from the constructivism Lanyon was actively working against. To demonstrate this, here are two paintings. On the right, we have Vase of Flowers by Karl Weschke in 1954, and on the left, Flowers and Silk, Blue Symphony by David Bomberg from 1947, and we can clearly see where Weschke is gaining his inspiration. And this was painted in the year before he moved to Tregarthen. At first, it was Weschke's interest in still life, but also the figurative and the animal that Lanyon felt was so useful, and therefore to be actively encouraged. This, I believe, is the reason that Weschke was quickly promoted to that position of being a tutor. Lanyon, it seems to me, and I'm sure we're learning by now, was at all times very strategic. And on screen is Weschke's seated figure from 1957, which was painted at the Loft. Weschke, as someone who was born into the Weimar Republic and then grew up in Nazi Germany, had a very different grounding in art and aesthetics. He, as a schoolchild, was taught that the figure was of paramount importance and that sculpture was a superior art form. Weschke began to find his feet as a painter in London, but I argue that his paintings, particularly evident in the late 1950s, retained something to sculptural. And this, I feel, had an impact on students such as Jeremy Le Grice. And next to the Weschke, we can see Rocks, one which was painted by Le Grice in the same year. Less refined, arguably more Lanyon-esque, but I sort of suggest that it remains somewhat gutsy, slightly sculptural, that sort of hard rock form being taken over by the sea. This experience of the land was key, and a reminder of that line that I shared earlier from the Loft's promotional pamphlet, which stated that students were encouraged to work out of doors. Lanyon in particular saw this as incredibly important, and this will come as no surprise for an artist that was mentored in the mid-1930s by Robert Borloo Smart, a celebrated painter of dynamic marine landscapes. Borloo Smart proclaimed the virtues of painting plein air, and conveying true experience of the land. And there is footage online if you give it a Google, and you can see Borloo Smart scrabbling up rocks of his, canvases under his arms and his easel over his shoulder. And a slight side note, Lanyon's respect for Borloo Smart was demonstrated in 1949. He suggested at the foundation of the Penwith Society that the second exhibition would become a memorial to his mentor, and that opened on the 23rd of September that year. And this is one of the original posters, which is mine. I own this. I found it online. Apparently printed by Guido Morris at the Latin Press, but I'd have to do a bit more research to confirm if that's true. I know that the Loft actually used Worden Press in Marazion to do their printing. Anyway, how did this importance of the land translate to Loft students? Well, returning to the recollections of Nancy Wynne-Jones, she tells us the following. Lanyon's teaching at the Loft was landscape-oriented. He would take us to places like Retallick to experience the sea and land with our bodies as well as our eyes. She also suggests that Lanyon did not teach in the traditional sense of the word, but he would instead seek to immerse his students in the landscape around them. Another student at the school was the poet W.S. Graham, who was dabbling in painting and drawing and was encouraged to attend by Weschke, who by that point was a good friend. Redgrave painted a portrait of him at the Loft, and we will be able to get a glimpse of that later. Graham's poem, The Thermal Stare, written in tribute to Lanyon, has a section which I believe recounts Lanyon's teaching, and I'll read that now. "Shall we go down, you said, before the light goes, and stand under the old tin workings around Morver and St Just? You said, here is the sea made by Alfred Wallace, or any poet or painter's eye it encountered. Or is it better made by all those vesseled men sometime it maintained? We will make it again. Give me your hand, Peter, to steady me on the word. And this certainly correlates to Wyn Jones's recollection. As well, in the Peter Davies book, St Ives Revisited, he explains how Grice, in his example, was encouraged by Lanyon to give everything, both physically and emotionally, with an emphasis on exploring the country in physical terms. When it came to Lanyon's technical demonstrations, these are also certainly valuable. He would show students how to grind their own colours, mix size, prepare canvases. And I know from my research that Lanyon was often frustrated by Redgrave's teaching, and the pair would often fall out. Lanyon and Frost, as we saw in that Bristow quote earlier, invited Redgrave to Loft in order to balance their modernist approaches. But in reality, Lanyon found Redgrave at times far too traditional. I have learnt, for example, that Lanyon would often rearrange the objects that Redgrave had laid out into compositions for still lifes, into what he felt were more dynamic configurations. As Wyn Jones also tells us, a splinter group of mostly older hobbyist students preferred what they saw as the traditional rigour of Redgrave. She says, I remember one woman, a nice middle-aged amateur, saying to me as she desperately tried to paint a vase of Sweet Williams, why won't Peter tell me how to do it? And herein lies the confusion about St Peter's Loft taking over a space at Porthmere Studios, as I mentioned earlier. So in my research, I've explored this line in the Val Baker publication. So to remind you of that line, the school now operates on one of Porthmere Studios. I explained to you earlier that this is not quite right, and it's indeed something that I've seen repeated in that scant material available. I have no reason to believe that Lanyon and Redgrave had a full-blown falling out, but instead I see Redgrave as quietly beginning to use his own studio at Porthmere, so Studio 3, as a means to teach, uninterrupted, the students who preferred him and his approaches. I believe that Val Baker, whose book was published in 1959, was asked by Lanyon and Redgrave to write that line. And this is because Mr. Thomas, the owner of the building, had put it up for sale in the same year, and therefore they knew that they would soon need to move out. In reality, this took another 2 years. As I've said, the building was seriously dilapidated, it was in much need of renovation, and I imagine it's quite hard to buy buyers brave enough to take it over. Wouldn't be the case now, I'm sure. The building, as we know, was sold to the Penwith Society of Art, and they moved in 1961, much to the annoyance of Lanyon, as you can well imagine. And I found a letter that he wrote to Paul Filer, dated the 15th of February 1961. So Filer was another of the regular tutors at the Loft. And Lanyon writes, there's not much news here except that the Penwith has the St Peter's Loft, a grant from the Gulbenkian and no members. Another reason I believe that Val Baker's line is preemptive is because of my findings of my research in regard to Francis Bacon's brief period here in St Ives. And on that note, I'm going to move on to Bacon. So many of you here will know that Bacon in September 1959 was sent to St Ives by Marlborough Fine Art, his London gallery, as a means of removing him from the distractions of his metropolitan London life. In particular, the temptations of Soho bars and Knightsbridge casinos. Bacon rented Redgrave's studio at Porthmere until he left in rather a hurry in January 1960. If you want to know more detail about that episode, I highly recommend my good friend Ian Massey's book, Queer St Ives and Other Stories. He deals with that in detail. In the course of my research, I now know that Bacon visited the Loft, and further proof that it remained in operation in its original location because of this. And indeed, he was socialising at the time with a number of the Loft's members, often drinking with them at the Sloop, which was the Loft's pub of choice. For example, in Daniel Farson's biography of Bacon, The Gilded Gutter Life, he mentions how Giles Orty, art critic for The Spectator, visited Bacon in St Ives and recounted how Bacon became a particular buddy of Francois Spencer Chapman. Spencer Chapman was a student at St Peter's Loft and had 2 years earlier received national notoriety when, as an 18-year-old ward of court, so someone who was looked after by the courts, she had dramatically eloped with a 28-year-old man named Richardson. Bacon was apparently familiar with this story, and there are a number of photos circulated in 1957 of Spencer Chapman in the press, looking rather glamorous, like a glamorous fugitive in this big trench coat with an upturned collar on a massive phone. It's of course well documented that Bacon was very attracted to outlaws. But the most significant evidence I found for the continuation of the loft in its original location are the words of Redgrave himself, who said, and I'm going to quote that in part here, "At the loft we set up a pottery, and the natural thing to do was model figures. When Francis Bacon came down, I did a little portrait model of him in clay, and it went into an edition of 20 in bronze, and this is what you can see here on screen. I know it was sculpted from life, and I'm able to pinpoint the exact day that it happened, so it's the 17th of October 1959, thanks to one of Redgrave's journal entries. So, as I said earlier, sculpture was not a new development for Redgrave, and the impulse certainly didn't happen because of his contact with Bacon. I know for certain that Redgrave was sculpting at the Loft in terracotta as early as 1957, but Bacon, being as well known as he was, I'm sure gave Redgrave a much needed boost. The two remained in contact, and Redgrave would leave St Ives to London in 1960, sort of almost following Bacon in a way. I've explored Bacon's contact with the Loft in significant detail in my PhD thesis, as well as his contact with Weschke. And I'm going to save some of the juicier stuff back for now, for the book, when that gets published. So another thing that I learnt from Redgrave's journal entries was that he and Bacon attended a dinner hosted by another of St Peter's Loft members, Wilhelmina Barns Graham, and she is the focus of my next slide. So it's been quite hard to pinpoint exactly when Barns Graham started to attend St Peter's Loft. I know for certain that she was there in 1957. It's probable that she is attending before this, and highly likely after. When I was chatting on the phone to Rachel back along, you knew her, and she spoke of the Loft quite fondly, I believe.
Well, she was working up there with me.
Yeah.
Obviously, she'd been there previously.
So yeah, it's stuck in her memory. In 1956, her then husband David Lewis began studying architecture at Leeds. Lanyon was also best man at their wedding, so I found out. And although their relationship was starting to break down, Willie joined them there, teaching for a short time at the art school. As the Wilhelmina Barns Graham Trust confirms, the relationship soon ended, and Willie returned to St Ives and Lewis left for Pittsburgh. Although very much apart, their divorce did not finalise until 1963. And I also know that in 1960, Willie inherited a house in St Andrews and was therefore dividing her time between Scotland and St Ives. But by then, the Loft was really sort of nearing its end. Barns Graham's work in the late 1950s certainly shares something in common with that of the other St Peter's Loft students. So take, for example, this painting that we see here on screen. So this is Wicker from 1957. Got the bus here this morning from Wicker Farm, which is quite the experience. And you can notice the pared down colour palette with that sort of tentative, sort of buttery flash of yellow poking through. The painting, as you have probably guessed, is titled after the boulder-strewn Wicker Pool, which is along from Tregerthen Beach near Zena. And these are stones throw from that cottage that Weschke lived in at the time, and I know that him and Weschke were friends. And as a slight aside to this, so Rob Airy, who is director of the Wilhelmina Barns Graham Trust, sent me a 1996 interview where she explained that Weschke once said to her, "You don't know what it's like, Willie, to be working class and German." And apparently she replied, "You don't know what it's like to be upper class and a double-barreled female amongst a lot of egotistical working class men." Willie was often caught up in what she described as personality conflicts, explaining how, as a result, she would often have to position herself as one of the boys. And I can imagine this was very much the case at the Loft, particularly with those Lanyon and Redgrave tensions that I mentioned earlier. It's clear, though, that the contact with the Loft was influential, taking the Loft's teachings on board, but pushing forward with her own clear interpretation. In this painting, for example, I wonder if it may be the result of one of Lanyon and Weschke's tutelage, maybe one of Lanyon's student excursions out into Penwith. There's certainly an interesting perspective on the land here. And to refer again to Nancy Wynne-Jones, she described how Lanyon would often take his students out into the car, out in a car, pointing out how on making your way through the Cornish landscape, aspects of it would suddenly appear to swing around you. Okay, I think there's time to talk about a few more students. Next up is Anthony Benjamin. So in a similar way to Weschke, Lanyon was also championed Anthony Benjamin, and indeed Benjamin moved to Penwith in 1955, the same year as Weschke. He lived at first in a cottage at Cripples Ease, which was previously home to Sven Berlin. Until his move to Cornwall, Benjamin was briefly represented by the Helen Lesauret Gallery in London, which became known for its promotion of artists that fell under this banner of the so-called kitchen sink school. This, I believe, was also of great appeal to Lanyon. On screen is a painting titled Early Winter's Evening and is from 1958, and we can clearly see how that visual language of the St Peter's Loft has been adopted, particularly with those characteristic dark and marshy colours. St Peter's Loft paintings are very much against that idea that Penwith was full of bright light. The abstracted landscape here is not one that reflects and dazzles, but instead seems to absorb light. And it can be said to be somewhat uninviting in a way. And I think this is a clear distinction, one that I believe is not representative of St Ives, but indeed the experience of West Cornwall more widely. With this considered, it's worth remembering that of the artists associated with the Loft, very few lived in St Ives proper, and therefore their experience of the Cornish landscape was probably quite different. So Benjamin, as I've already said, lived at Cripples Ease, Weschke at Tregerthen, Brian Winter near Zena, W.S. Graham at Gurnard's Head. Also, Weschke was German, Barns Graham and W.S. Graham were from Scotland, Benjamin from Winchester, O'Malley from Ireland, you get the idea. At the start of this talk, I asked you to keep the words regional and minority in mind. I believe that Lanyon's gathering of these outsiders was absolutely strategic. After all, we heard earlier in his own words how he was often made to feel like an alien in his own hometown. In using the Loft to bring together a core group of incomers, he would work towards his aim of a genre of painting that was distinctly new and, most importantly, of Cornwall. This is something I thoroughly explore in my thesis, and indeed we will see further evidence of this position later. To return to Benjamin, in 1958, the same year that this work was painted, he was awarded a 3-month fellowship to France, which was organised by the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As part of this, the ministry arranged for Benjamin to meet Marc Chagall, and I'm lucky enough to have seen the letter that was sent to Chagall to introduce him to Benjamin, and it's a wonderful piece of art historical documentation. And in their letter to Chagall, they write the following. Mr. Anthony Benjamin is a painter of British nationality, and he is invited to come and spend a few months studying in Paris. Mr. Benjamin is currently a teacher of drawing and painting at the St Peter's Loft School in St Ives. Of course, as a sort of geeky art historian, I love that Chagall was made aware of St Peter's Loft and its existence. And this is a photograph that's taken in the St Peter's Loft print studio. We can see the beret-wearing Peter Lanyon there in the middle, cranking the wheel of the press. And the person to the right of the image in the white shirt is Lyndon Holman. Professionally known as Lyndon Travers, she was an actor of stage and screen and was known for starring in plays by the likes of Ivor Novello, for example, Murder in Mayfair in 1933, and films to include Alfred Hitchcock's The Lady Vanishes in 1938. And although undated, I think this is probably around 1957, I think. Sadly, I don't have much information about her time at the Loft, but Travers became a regular face at the Loft in its final years, often using the space for her paintings. I've not seen any of those, unfortunately. However, I did talk to her daughter Susan, who is also an actor, and she told me that she would often join her mother at the Loft. And she used to model there in her youth for a payment of 10 shillings and sixpence a morning, which is a great little insight, I think, into the day-to-day working of the Loft. Okay, I'm going to move on to my final artist, but one who I think is arguably one of the more well-known Loft students, but for some reason is consistently forgotten about when we talk about Penwith and its art histories, and that is Joe Tilson. On screen we've got two images. The first, a painting by Tilson titled Conquer from 1958 to 59. The second, an image of the artist with Peter Blake at Conquer Downs in 1958. Conquer Downs, for those of you who don't know, is just outside Nancledra, so 4 miles from here, maybe. You'll probably know Tilson much better for his involvement in British pop art in the 1960s, but living at Conquer, he became a regular student of the Loft in the mid to late 50s. And in paintings such as this, we see an artist very much experimenting and finding his feet, and I believe very much helped by the contact of the Loft. After all, his first solo exhibition was at the Marlborough Fine Art in 1962, a year after Loft ceased its operations. The painting certainly shares something in common with other artworks we've seen today. We can see that guiding hand of Lanyon, but in the early days of the Loft, Tilson's works were very much aligned to the teachings of William Redgrave. And here we have Tilson's still life with Cafetiere from 1955, very much in keeping, returning to O'Malley's words earlier, with the Loft being full of brown boards and oil. And next to that photo, I think, unless anybody here can tell me any different, I think this is Joe Tilson sat here, to the best of my knowledge. And that's Redgrave with his back turned to us. And I sort of love this image, because this feels like very much Redgrave's domain here, this little corner of the Loft. Although the school was very much based here in St Ives, we've seen how Lanyon became vocally disillusioned at the town and its artistic formations. In the latter part of the 1950s, Lanyon would seek opportunities for his students elsewhere in Penwith, and Newlyn became the place where he could showcase his new Cornish art. In summer 1956, Michael Canny took the helm of Newlyn Art Gallery and made Lanyon chairman of the Newlyn Society of Artists in the same year. In 1958, Canny and Lanyon organised an exhibition at Newlyn Gallery that was titled 20 Cornish Artists, and included amongst the artists exhibited were Weschke, Grice, Benjamin, Redgrave, Wyn Jones and Lanyon himself. It was an exhibition that was predominantly the artists connected to the Loft, and in the accompanying catalogue, Canny writes the following. The influence of Ben Nicholson on the younger artists is less obvious today than it was 5 years ago, and is partly supplanted by that of Tashism and action painting and enthusiasm for plein air, figure composition, which has gradually given way to an equal enthusiasm for the landscape of West Penwith and its unique coastline. Just over a year later, Mark Rothko was to make his famous visit to St Ives in August 1959, and he stayed with Lanyon at his home Little Park Owls in Carbis Bay. Lanyon drove Rothko over to Newlyn to see the gallery. Rothko was toured around Penwith by Lanyon, visiting a number of artists. They even went to the Tinner's Arms in Zena for a pint, apparently. Although I found no concrete evidence of this, I am absolutely certain that Rothko would have visited the Loft as part of this itinerary. I'd be very surprised if Lanyon left it out. So this is sort of where I'm going to leave things for today. I hope this has given you a valuable insight into one of the most bizarrely overlooked formations in relation to St Ives and wider West Cornwall. But before I finish and allow time for questions, I have an absolute treat for you. And I'm really excited to show you this. So this hasn't been seen in its entirety since 1958. In 1958, the BBC visited Cornwall, and they came here to interview a number of artists that were living and working here. It took quite some effort to track this down, a lot of permissions forms, but the BBC have given me permission and issued me with a licence to show this to you this evening. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.